1984, there were 16 IBM Selectric typewriters at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow that were bugged by the Soviets with one of these bugs that could listen in to the little arms and push rods that moved the Selectric ball. And for 8 solid years, for those 8 years, everything typed on those 16 IBM Selectric typewriters was beamed directly to the KGB. And the only reason the U.S. figured it out in 1984 is because another country that had been bugged this same way by the KGB figured it out in one of their own facilities, and since they were our ally, they tipped us off that maybe we should check this. Hey, are you guys using Selectric typewriters, particularly at your embassies and consulates in Russia? You may want to get them x-rayed and check for this particular sophisticated bug that the Russians made up and that we have found them using against us. So those 16 compromised IBM Selectric typewriters, those were an intelligence disaster for the United States for 8 solid years as they broadcast everything typed inside the embassy. But they were finally discovered in 1984. And when that got found out in 1984, that was a time when we were finding out a lot of other things that were very, very bad about our embassy and the Russians spying on us and spying on that embassy around that time. One of the biggest scandals, one of the biggest failures ever on the part of the United States when it came to spying in Russia started in 1969, when then President Richard Nixon came to a hard-fought agreement with the Soviet Union. And the agreement was that the Soviets would be allowed to build a new Soviet embassy in Washington, and we, simultaneously, would be allowed to build a new American embassy in Moscow. That was agreed to after much negotiation in 1969. They weren't actually ready to start construction itself in Moscow until a decade later in 1979. And if you think about that time in modern U.S. history, this is a very chilly part of the Cold War, right? And by the time the U.S. was ready to start construction on our new embassy in Moscow in 1979, the sure fact that that embassy would be a target of advanced Russian spying operations was very much on American officials' minds. It was very much in American news. I mean, this was a front and center concern about building a new embassy in Moscow. Not just because U.S. and Russian spies were always targeting each other, but also because right before we started construction, we had just discovered a major Russian intelligence operation for them to spy on our existing facilities in Moscow. This is a news report from 1978, the year before we started building the new embassy. Part of the reason I want to show this is because it's relevant to this story, but part of the reason I want to show it is because of the amazing graphics in this news report. Watch.
The most recent Soviet-American rift involves the discovery of yet another Soviet listening device in the American embassy in Moscow. Events of this kind are not always made public, but this one, discovered on May 25th, was disclosed by American officials today. Fort Rowan has the details.
The Russian KGB agents operated out of an apartment building just across the street from the American embassy. They used a cable which ran from the listening post through a secret tunnel under the street, into the embassy basement, and up a ventilating shaft to the 7th floor. American personnel found surveillance equipment in the shaft, including a disc-shaped antenna-like device. During the search, the Americans surprised a Russian agent who fled from his listening post.
So in 1969, Nixon had agreed with the Russians that they would get to build a new embassy here, and that we would get to build a new embassy there. Then all through the 70s, we continued to discover the Russians bugging our existing embassy and our diplomatic facilities in Russia, including them having a secret tunnel under the street into our embassy as late as 1978. But then in 1979, we started building our new embassy in Moscow. And it's now clear in retrospect that in that decision, we made what is now, quite obviously, in retrospect, an absolutely ridiculous error as a country, right? And this was a high-level negotiated thing. You know, the highest levels of the administration were involved in negotiating this fact that the Russians get to build their embassy and we get to build our embassy, and it's simultaneous, and there's a big team of high-level government people negotiating the exact terms under which all the construction will be managed, right? This is something that the government worked really hard on over a period of years, but somehow at the end of that process, the U.S. agreed to a deal that had a major flaw. See if you can figure out what it was. On the Russia side of the equation, when they were building their embassy in Washington, their part of the deal said that all building materials for their embassy would be constructed on site. They had Soviet officials on site, overseeing every aspect of the construction, down to the level of every single beam, every single board. Everything that went into that embassy was cut and cast and assembled at the building site under their own people's supervision. And just to be doubly safe, every component that went into building the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. was x-rayed piece by piece as it was put together to make sure there was no funny business, there was no CIA bugs for the Russian embassy. Right? Nothing had been inserted into the construction materials somehow. That was the Russian side of the deal. The American side of the deal was different.
End of segment 2.